So hello everybody and welcome to this evening's second webinar of our series about the Wild Water Whales project. And tonight we've got a really exciting programme. We're going to talk a bit about right whales, but we're also going to talk about humpback whale and blue whale discoveries from our surveys in the last 3 years. Just to orient you all to the webinar features that we have here, you have an option to ask questions in the Q&A box, which should be found at the bottom of the screen. So please do ask questions and we will try to answer as many questions as we can in person after each talk. So we've set some time aside for that. But if we run out of time, the panelists will also endeavour to answer questions by text as well. So please keep an eye on the Q&A box as we go. So first, I'd just like to start by thanking all of the funders who made this work possible. This is wrapping up the Darwin project, which has been running since 2017. And we've also had significant funding from the EU Best Medium Grant, Friends of South Georgia Island, South Georgia Heritage Trust, and from World Wildlife Fund UK. We've had logistical support from the government of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. And if you'd like to follow our news and updates, please look up the South Georgia Right Whale Project on Facebook. I'd also like to thank the South Georgia Heritage Trust, who've kindly helped us to host this event on behalf of myself and the British Antarctic Survey tonight. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview about some of the things we found, and then I'm going to let the team tell you in a bit more detail about what we know about whale recovery at South Georgia Island. This is a repeat of a slide I showed yesterday for those who are not familiar. South Georgia is in subpolar waters in the high latitudes of the South Atlantic. In purple, you can see lines which represent oceanic fronts, and you can see that South Georgia is wrapped with the oceanic front and the southern Antarctic circumpolar current front, which wraps around the island, and it brings in huge quantities. This easterly flowing current brings in huge quantities of Antarctic krill to South Georgia. And it's because of that current and the location of South Georgia that it has a very high biomass of krill predators, penguins, seals, seabirds, and historically also whales. This is a slide I showed yesterday, but again, just for quick orientation for anybody who wasn't present, there was an enormous historical catch of whales at South Georgia. Over 176,000 whales were taken. So we know it was historically a really important place for whales. Now, the species that we're going to talk about a bit more tonight, humpback whales, over 26,000 whales were caught at South Georgia. And for the Southwest Atlantic population, that was a large proportion of the total catches made out of that population in the 20th century. Blue whales had an even heavier toll, over 42,000 whales killed, just within a day's sailing of South Georgia. So it was a really important place for both species. In 2018, we conducted surveys on a yacht called Song of the Whale, run by Marine Conservation International, and Marine Conservation Research. And we mostly did surveys close to the north coast of the South Georgia Island. In 2019, we operated from powerboats at King Edward Point Station, which is in the centre of the north coast, and we did surveys between Stromness in the west and St Andrews Bay in the east. The biggest survey was conducted in 2020 on the Braveheart, and that vessel went around the island, the whole island, twice, and gave some unprecedented views into what was going on the other side, which hadn't previously ever been surveyed for whales on the south side of the island. We collected a variety of data sets. So we satellite tracked whales, we collected blow samples, we got photo IDs, both of the whales from the side and some overhead images, and we collected biopsy samples for isotopes, genetics, hormone analysis. And I'd like to give you just a quick overview of the data we've collected. Relative to breeding grounds, these are small data sets, I recognise that, but also need to recognise what a tough place it is to work, and that for the years that we've been working down there, we've dealt with some fairly adverse weather conditions. So you can see that these data sets are growing. And so I can draw your attention, for example, to the sonobuoy detections. That's the acoustic detections of different whales mostly humpbacks, rights and blue whales. We're building photo ID catalogues, which we're sharing with all catalogue holders who are interested in matching, and there'll be more on that later. Collecting overhead images, skin samples for genetics and for studying the isotope chemistry of the skin, blubber samples for hormones. Fecal samples are useful because you can look genetically at the diet of the whale and based on the contents of the fecal sample. So we are analysing one for right whales. And whale blow samples in order to understand microbial health, as well as satellite tracking. Finally, we collected 4 echo sounder active acoustic data sets where we did echo sounder surveys in close vicinity of right whale feeding in order to try and find out more about the prey field. Tonight, you're going to hear stories about the scientists working on these data sets and what we're doing with them. So we're going to hear more about the blue whale detections from Susie later on, the photo IDs from Ted, and also from Amy for health analysis. Fredrik's going to talk about using overhead images for health analysis. Carolyn's going to tell us about how she uses whale blow to study the microbial health of right and humpback whales. And Connor's going to give us a broader perspective about humpback whale movements and habitat use, combining South Georgia data that we have with Alex Zerbini's data tracking right whales from Brazil. So that's all going to be coming up. I just wanted to give you another little view of what was happening in South Georgia when we did the surveys in 2019. We cited humpbacks 41 times in 15 surveys. And this map on the right just shows you the scale that we were doing surveys at. So it was quite a small scale. But what was really surprising about it was that we actually saw a lot of humpbacks. We never saw a right whale. And during that time, the number of sightings of humpbacks over 9 surveys in January was the same as the number of catches of humpbacks made in January in 1905. 1905 was the very first summer that the whalers were operating in Cumberland Bay, and famously Larson's whalers didn't leave the bay in that season. They were operating on 1 catcher vessel, the Fortuna, and they caught the same number of whales that we cited in our surveys in 2019. We had less surveys in February and saw less whales, but I think it's a really nice point to highlight that it does seem as if humpback whales are now occurring at numbers that may even be similar to those that the whalers were seeing 100 years ago. I should also note that, of course, they were also seeing blue and fin whales in Cumberland Bay. We are not. There's an occasional, very occasional record, but it's not a common occurrence yet, and that probably reflects the fact that humpback whales are recovering faster and are more recovered now, I think, than blue and fin whales in this area. In 2020, as I mentioned, the Braveheart went all the way around the South Georgia Island, and you can see in green the visual survey effort, an absolutely stupendous amount of work put in by the team, who you can see here on the left, who did an amazing amount of work in about 23 days of survey, including doing the echo sounder deployments to look at the prey field in 4 locations. And their work was really rewarded. They cited 734 humpbacks and 58 blue whales, among other sightings. And so again, that's another sign of lots of humpbacks. And Russell Leap is going to be talking tonight more about the humpback whale data and what that might help us understand about density patterns around South Georgia. So finally, I just want to give a huge thanks to all the institutes involved in our work and to the funders who've made this possible, and all of the other institutes who've helped by sharing kit with us and giving us extra support. It's taken a village, and I hope that this is the beginning of many more great collaborations and interesting work to come. Thanks. Now, I think I have a couple of minutes. Okay, so we have a couple of questions on the Q&A. So Terry is asking, what's the average age that whales live for? That is quite variable. Now, right whales could live for quite a long time. They could live well upwards of 50 years. There may be somebody on the panel who's happy to take that. Do put your hand up if you like, but I know, of course, they're close cousins. The bowhead whales live for more than 100 years. So it's possible that right whales are living for over 50 years, but I'm not quite sure of the average myself. Humpback whale, I think the average age is a bit younger, but we're talking about decades rather than, say, for example, a human lifespan. They'll be their age is at least, I think, probably more. Their average age is going to be somewhere between 30 and 40 years, I think. But if anyone on the team wants to comment on that, nope. Okay. Oh, Ted,
Sure,
do you want?
yeah, sorry, jumping in late. We have the oldest known humpback that we have in our data set. Happywhale is a fellow named Old Timer. I think known a male. I'm not sure. First sighted in 19. No, now I better check this. But it's known to be just seen last year, and I think first sighted in the late 70s. One second here, and I'll even check that out. But it's certain. I mean, my take on humpback whales anyway is that it's sort of a life expectancy maybe similar to humans pre-Western medicine. It's kind of the frame I like to use. First sighted in 1972, and was presumably at least 3 or 4 years old, such that the fluke was able to be identified then. So,
thanks very much, Ted. And we have another question from Michael Cassidy. So he's asking, how on earth do you collect blow samples? That's a question that some members of the panel could probably answer better than me. I could give you a quick overview, but effectively with a drone and a Petri dish is the short answer. Carolyn, in her talk tonight, is going to go into that in a little bit more detail, so you can get a bit more of that from her. And I think that's probably it. Oh, another question from Elisa. Are you planning another similar cruise to South Georgia in the near future? Well, we're very much hoping to get back to South Georgia. Obviously, with the pandemic at the moment, there's not much research going on in the Southern Ocean. But yes, we're looking for funds to do further research. And it may be that it's going to be closer to shore because it's more feasible to do work near Cumberland Bay. Given, Martin Collins is going to talk about this evening, that we do work close to shore in the near future until we can identify a good charter vessel to continue doing some of the research we've been doing. Okay. Any comments from anyone else? So I think we shall move on to the next stage of the programme. And next, I want to introduce, Dr. Amy Kennedy and Fredrik Christiansen. They're going to talk about right whale health at South Georgia. So I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, I'll start sharing my screen here. How's that? Are we in the correct view there?
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk about visual health assessment from the imagery that we collected, both that we received from Happywhale and that we collected during our surveys. And this is just slightly different from health assessments that people will be doing from overhead imagery, and Fred's going to talk about that next, but I'll just jump right in here. So I did not invent these methods, obviously. These were first initiated by Pettis et al. In 2004. And here's just an overview of exactly how we scored each image. So there are good, medium, and poor scores for each health parameter there, and I'll talk about them individually here. So looking at side-on imagery to score the body condition, we're looking at degree of concavity post blowhole, and so just behind the blowhole there, is there a dip, or is there a hump, or is it perfectly flat? Essentially, that's what we're looking for there. This is an image that I scored as good. It's pretty flat post blowhole, but to give you an example of a medium, not the best angle, but you can really see that the body condition is very different. So back to good, nice and flat post blowhole. And then here, medium, we call this, just as a nickname, we call this peanut head. It has a big hump post blowhole, but then a really big dip past that. So again, another look at a medium body image score based just on that dip post blowhole there. skin condition. This is an animal that I rated good, and it's just the amount of lesions or the amount of overall cyamids or major sloughed skin patches. And this is an example of a poor skin condition. So again, you'll see here, good, that's basically all black, pretty smooth animal, has a couple bumps here and there, but overall the skin condition is pretty uniform and black. And then this would be considered poor skin condition. Hopefully it shows up on your screen, but you can see there's a lot of sloughing and a lot of gray patches on the animal. Here is an example of what we call rake marks. I started with the good one, so I can't really show you rake marks here, but basically there's this phenomenon in right whales that are considered to have potentially compromised health, in that they have these rake marks. They really look like stretch marks, like human stretch marks, and they occur directly underneath the blowhole. And so this is an example of a whale that maybe has one rake mark, but overall this is good, very few rake marks. And here is an example of medium. They can even get stronger than this. So these are these lines or striations here just near the blowhole. We call those rake marks. And those are the essential overall parameters we were scoring on. Another one we used was cyamids around the blowhole. We had very, very few animals with cyamids near the blowhole, so I didn't show that one as an example. But just in case it's sort of hard to see, I'll just give you a comparison of the top whale is a whale we saw in 2020. Overall kind of poor rankings. So poor skin, pretty obvious there, huge patches of sloughed gray skin, poor quality rake marks. So not only are they, is it rough post blowhole, but the rake marks really striate and go kind of fairly deep into the, towards the animal's lip line. And then medium body condition. There's not a huge dip here, but there is a little bit of a dip post blowhole in the fat content post blowhole there. Just as a comparison, this animal on the bottom is one that I would consider good on all parameters. So really good skin, you can see very black and uniform. Good rake marks, meaning there are none that I can see. And good body condition. This is what I mean when I say post blowhole, that animal just looks like a big fat tube essentially with no dip post blowhole. Pretty uniform across there. And so for our results, we had a pretty high percentage of good ratings across all 4 parameters. But we did have 44% with body condition rated as medium, meaning that had a little bit of a dip post blowhole there, so lower body fat than animals that aren't rated medium. Let's see, 46.2 with skin condition poor, so that's probably our highest rating of poor or compromised skin condition. And we had about 38.9% with rake marks rated as medium or poor combined. So those are our overall results. Cyamids, again, we only had 1 whale with post blowhole cyamids, so it was a very low percentage for that criteria. Just overall, just to give you a perspective, if you look at the Pettis et al. Paper and then a recent Rolland et al. 2016 paper, these guys were analyzing North Atlantic right whales, and they were able to analyze over 200,000 images, 48,000 sightings over 70 years. So they have many, many, many repeat animals that they're seeing every single year, and they're able to compare health scores from one year to the next, and basing that all on, you know, their life history parameters and whether they've had any kind of collisions with ships or entanglements and things like that. So what they found over that huge data set is that juveniles and adult males receive the best health scores, whereas the resting and lactating females receive the poorest health scores, which makes sense. You know, you'd expect an animal's body condition to be a little bit lower fat content overall if they're lactating or raising a child. Oh, and then finally, the body condition scores were slightly higher, which means thinner, for cows with a calf, again, versus a non-calf year. So for us in South Georgia, this is really just the beginning. We have very low numbers of animals, as you remember from our catalog talk. We have very low to basically no resighting history, so it's hard to make any kind of long-term comparisons. The variability in body fat percentage could happen for a number of reasons, and I don't think we know our animals as well or well enough to say what a body fat rating means for them in the long term. And then also the relationship of all these factors together is very difficult to understand unless you have a really long sighting history for the animals. But just wanted to show you guys the results from what we have and what we'll hopefully get from any future sightings that come in, anything from Happywhale or images that folks get. Even if I can't make an ID, I'll use the data set to make body health assessments or visual health assessments. And so it's really just the beginning. It's hard to say what the overall data mean until we get a much bigger database. And that's what I have. I'm going to pass it over to Mr. Christiansen. Let's see, stop share. There we go.
Okay, thank you very much. I didn't have the pleasure to go to South Georgia, but I had the pleasure to analyze the data on body condition or health. And maybe before going any further, we should define what body condition actually is. So it's a measure of the relative amount of energy reserves or fat reserves that the whales have. And why is this important? Well, most baleen whales, including southern right whales, need energy reserves, so they need to store energy during part of the year. So they feed in South Georgia or other feeding grounds where they build up a lot of fat reserves. And then they use this during the breeding season, which occurs during the winter time, to support themselves and to support the growth of their newborn offsprings and so on. And whales are really good at storing energy. They can store it. They have a big fat layer around their body called the blubber layer. They also have fat in their muscle tissue, around their organs, and even fat inside the bones. So, and all of that can kind of be captured by the volume or mass of the animal if you compare it to its structural size or its length. So the purpose of this analysis was to compare the body condition of southern right whale in South Georgia, which is a feeding ground, to the breeding ground, which is closest by, which is Peninsula Valdez in Argentina. And this is interesting because this could give us some insight into how the animals are both spending the energy reserves during the breeding season in Argentina and how they then gain this energy or recover this energy when they're in South Georgia. So to collect or to measure the body condition in baleen whales, including right whales, we use a method called aerial photogrammetry or drone photogrammetry. So you basically photograph the whales from above when they come up to surface. And you can do this quite easily with drones. Not so easily in South Georgia because it's really rough conditions and so on. But if you manage to get the drone or an airplane or whatever over a whale and take an aerial photograph, if you could get something that, let's kind of fix the pointer here. If you can get a picture like this, you can actually measure the length of the animal and the width of the animal at different points. And if you combine these measurements, you can actually create a 3D model of the volume of the animal. And by standardizing that against the length of the animal, so its structural size, you can actually come up with a measure of relative fatness or body condition. And that's what we did in this case. So we did it for whales in South Georgia and in Argentina as well. And we come up with all these different measurements, which by themselves means nothing. But if you compare it to the average of the sample, you can actually say if an individual whale is fatter or thinner than an average whale in the sample population. So I collected data in Argentina in 2018 and 19. I was going to do it in 2020, but we all know what happened that year. So I had to compare it from Argentina from 2019 to South Georgia 2020, unfortunately. But in Argentina, we managed to sample a lot of whales over a 4-month period, which is the breeding ground or breeding season for the whales. And we managed to measure 232 individuals, of which 67 were adults and the rest were juveniles. And in South Georgia, because of difficult conditions that Jen described earlier, we managed to sample, or Daryl McDonald, who was the pilot, managed to sample 5 individuals that were of adequate quality to actually measure their condition. 3 of these were adults. You can see all these 5 animals in the bottom, by the way. The adults are here here, and here, and they were all females. And we also managed to measure 2 juveniles, 1 female and 1 male. And if we compare these, so here you can see juveniles and adults comparing the South Georgia, the 2 animals with the Argentinian 165, and also the adults we're comparing South Georgia and Argentina. You can see that the body condition is not very different. So the animals that were sampled in South Georgia falls within the range of body conditions that were observed in Argentina. And that makes a lot of sense because Argentina is where the whales lose their condition. So they arrive in Argentina and they're not feeding, so they're just losing their condition over the season. And you can see that to the right here, where the y-axis is the body condition of the animal and the x-axis is the day in the year. So in the winter, in the austral or in the southern hemisphere, you can see that the adults, which is the blue line here, they are slowly declining in health or body condition. And the juveniles didn't show any marked difference in condition, but these are all different individuals. So timing of sampling could influence this as well. But anyways, you see the adults are losing their condition. And then at some point they migrate back to the feeding grounds and they will regain this energy. And this measurements we have from South Georgia shows that at some point they are gaining this much body condition. So we don't know the rate at which they acquire it, but this information at least gives us an idea of kind of starting to guess of how quickly they are gaining the fat reserve that they lose during the breeding season. So this, even though these are only 5 measurements, they are really valuable because these are the only feeding ground samples we have of southern right whales. So it's really valuable information. And if we can continue this over more years and get a bigger spread of the data during the feeding season, it would be really interesting to see how this recovery occurs and how quickly individual right whales actually manage to regain their lost condition. And that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening. And I guess this is time for questions now.
Thanks very much, Fredrik. And thanks to both of you. I'm going to take a question on for each of you here. So the first, I have a question here from Fiona Kavanagh. What causes the bad skin conditions, Amy? Is it age?
Yeah, I don't know. It's really hard to tell. These skin conditions can change also throughout the season. And so there are probably a number of factors related to this. In North Atlantic right whales, obviously they have a long history of animals that have been entangled and then either shed or get disentangled and their skin condition improves. So for animals that haven't been entangled, it's hard to know, but it can change from year to year. It can even, maybe not an extremely bad skin condition, but it could potentially, small patches could change even within one season. So it's probably a number of different reasons. And I see that there's a rake mark question as well. And I think the rake mark thing is really fascinating because I don't think anybody understands exactly why they're formed or how they're formed, but it's just been long noticed, especially since the early 70s when they started looking at right whales, that rake marks really kind of come hand in hand with a really unhealthy and overall poor health animal. But we don't know why they are formed and sort of how they come to exist and why they're associated with unhealthy animals.
Thanks very much, Amy. I have a question for Fredrik here. For aerial photogrammetry, does the image have to be taken directly above the head, and is one photo enough?
Yes, they need to be pretty much straight above the animal, because if you don't see the contour of the animal very clearly, you can get a very biased estimate. One picture could be enough if it's a really good picture, but it's better generally to have a few different pictures, especially if you have bad conditions, weather conditions, so you can actually compare them and see what your average becomes. So for this analysis, I picked the best measurements of several measurements of each individual.
Thanks very much, Fredrik. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the next speaker, and that's Dr. Carolyn Miller. She's going to tell us a bit about the microbiome work that's been done at Woods Hole and how our South Georgia samples are going to feed into that. Carolyn, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, and I'll start sharing the screen. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. And do I have the right view on there?
It's the slide tool at the moment, not the actual full presentation.
It's not the actual presentation. Huh, that's strange. Let me try again. How about that?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So now I can't, there we go. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to present today. I am Carolyn Miller, and I conduct this research in the laboratory of Amy April at the Hole Oceanographic Institution. During the expedition to South Georgia, as you heard, samples of exhaled breath, which is commonly referred to as whale blow, were collected from 3 right whales, 2 humpback whales, and a blue whale. Unfortunately, we were delayed in processing these samples because of the pandemic. So for this talk, I will tell the story of why and how we study microbiomes of blow and present some of our findings on samples of blow collected from other populations of humpback and right whales. And in doing so, my aim is to demonstrate that the value of examining the microbiomes in these types of samples and the potential ways in which the signatures of respiratory microbiomes may provide insight into health. Okay. The work I will be presenting is part of a huge collaborative effort with the team listed here, as well as a number of generous people who have helped in the field and in the lab. So what is a microbiome? Well, a microbiome is, in simplest terms, is an assemblage of microorganisms. So we're basically talking about the entire community of bacteria, archaea, fungi, small protists, and so on. But for this presentation, I will be focusing solely on bacteria. So why study the microbiomes? Well, clear links continue to be established between the microbiome and human health. In fact, it's actually astounding how many of our biological systems are affected by our microbiomes, such as immune function, body condition, and even behavior. And so, for example, evidence shows that altered gut microbiomes play a causal role in a number of inflammatory diseases. So there's a lot more to learn about how or why these connections exist between human health and microbiomes. But the tremendous innovations and the results from the research on human and animal models can be leveraged for investigations into wildlife health, including that of free-swimming whales. So why respiratory microbiomes? Well, respiratory illness can be common in whales and dolphins, but cases are diagnosed mostly in live stranded or dead whales. And that is because, as you can imagine, it is simply not really feasible to swab the inside of the respiratory tract of a free-swimming whale. So in humans, exhaled breath is used to test for bacterial and fungal infections of the lower respiratory tract. So our group set out to investigate whether or not the respiratory microbiome can be detected in samples of whale blow. And if so, can the respiratory microbiomes of whales provide meaningful information about their health? Another reason we are targeting blow samples, blow microbiomes, is that we can now collect the samples non-invasively with small, remotely operated aerial drones. We also use these drones, as you saw from Fredrik, to collect high-resolution vertical images of the same whales that we sample so that we can measure body condition as a metric of health to link back to the microbiome. These, the samples are collected for this particular drone are collected on the plate on the top by flying the drone into the blow when the whale exhales, like this. We also collect lots of controls, including nearby seawater and flight controls. We then take the sample back to the lab, and after some processing steps, we sequence the sample to conduct a survey of a gene that is a biomarker for bacteria and archaea. From this, we typically detect a few hundred bacterial species in a sample's microbiome. So I'll start by showing you some results from our study on blow collected from 2 populations of humpback whales in the Northwest Atlantic off Cape Cod and the Northeast Pacific off the coast of the Vancouver Islands. One of the most intriguing and exciting results from this study was the observation that 25 bacterial species were present in all of the samples that we collected. So we call this a conserved core microbiome. To start, this is the largest core community that has been documented, more so than in even in humans. And it is also amazing to see that many bacterial species are common to all of the samples, despite the fact that the samples were collected from whales residing in 2 different ocean basins. So this figure is a box plot of the abundances of those 25 core bacteria, which you can see are oriented along the horizontal axis, and their abundances along the vertical axis, and each point represents the abundance in a sample. 20 of those 25 core bacteria showed homology to bacteria associated with other marine mammals, and mostly this is from dolphin blowholes. 2 were associated with bacteria associated with terrestrial mammals, and 3 with seawater. And we know that some seawater does enter and exit the blowhole cavity based on another study by other methods, but the majority of the microbiome seems to be originating from the whales. So overall, this large conserved core microbiome finding in seemingly healthy whales is really important for developing the blow microbiome as a metric of health. So knowing what is normal for the animals will allow us to detect differences that may be indicative of disease. And now for the preliminary results from our multi-year, multi-habitat study of blow microbiomes from both North Atlantic and Southern right whales. Over 100 samples are represented in this data set, and the North Atlantic animals were sampled in both their feeding and the calving habitats, while the 2 Southern right whale populations were sampled on the breeding grounds. And like the results from humpback whales, right whales also have core bacteria. However, we did not detect bacteria common to all of the samples in this preliminary analysis. But we did find 7 bacteria common to 90% of the samples. Here I am showing the abundances of those 7 bacteria. Each bar along the horizontal axis is a sample with the abundances of the 7 bacteria stacked along the vertical axis, and the plot is faceted by the population. And as you can see, the abundances of the 7 bacteria vary by sample and may thus indicate something about the condition of the animals as we move further with our analysis. This plot is a little bit daunting, so I'll walk you through what it means. Basically, it shows the similarities of the microbiomes among the samples such that each point represents the microbiome of the sample, and the distance between the points indicates how similar the microbiomes are. So the closer together the points, the more similar they are. The ellipses show the variance around the mean of the microbiomes for groups of samples. So we found that the microbial communities in our preliminary analysis were significantly different between North Atlantic and Southern right whales. This difference in blow-associated microbiomes among right whale populations is intriguing given the conspicuous differences in the status of the 2 species. Basically, North Atlantic right whales are declining while the Southern right whales are faring better. And the difference between the population microbiomes is also intriguing given the striking difference in body condition. And Fredrik just published a paper on that. So in conclusion, we are making steady progress in understanding the microbiomes of whale blow. We will be exploring these microbiomes in the context of body condition measurements, as well as life history traits and other indices of health such as scarring and skin lesions. We will be examining the core bacteria of whales because it shows promise for detecting whether or not a whale has a healthy microbiome. We will be screening the data set for relatives of pathogens, and we'll likely be sequencing some of the samples more thoroughly with finer resolution to look for fungi, viruses, and genes involved in virulence, which are often indicative of pathogenicity. The samples from South Georgia expedition will be a really lovely addition to these data sets for a number of reasons. For one thing, as I mentioned, we have samples from the winter habitats for southern right whales. And now, thanks to the South Georgia expedition, we have samples from a feeding habitat so that we now can go back and compare with the samples from the North Atlantic feeding habitat. We also will look to see how the microbiomes of the South Georgia samples compare with those from Argentina. And of course, well, and New Zealand. And of course, we will look to see if the 7 bacteria common to the right whales sampled thus far are detected in the samples from South Georgia. For the humpback whales, it'll be interesting to see if the 25 core bacteria detected in the samples from the Northern Hemisphere are also present in the bowl microbiomes from South Georgia. Additionally, we have samples from humpback whales collected off the coast of Chile and Western Antarctic Peninsula, and we will use those to compare with the South Georgia samples. This talk only touched on some of the highlights from our results, and the results from the right whale part of the talk are preliminary. There's a lot more to discover in these samples, and I look forward to sharing more in the future. And I also couldn't give this talk without showing you a view of the blowholes that we get while we are blow sampling, which is this. Thank you so much for your attention, and thanks to all my collaborators and funders and the many, many generous, hardworking people who have helped to make this happen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carolyn.
Sure.
That's really interesting, and I can't wait to see what results we get from the South Georgia samples. And we have a question from Mike Gibson. Would sampling lower collect different microbiomes from lower in the respiratory tract? Do you get differences that might depend on the height of sampling above whales?
Well, the differences are mostly generated from the volume collected. So the higher we are above the blowholes, probably the less volume we tend to collect. You know, we still need to do some ground truthing with animals at necropsy so that we can actually go down the respiratory tract and sample the microbiomes as we go along and see how those compare to the blow samples.
Thanks very much.
Sure.
I had a quick question, which was more about, so could you potentially use the microbiome to diagnose or define a population? I mean, not so much define as actually characterize it. If you had a microbiome from a whale with enough samples, if you had a microbiome from a whale from an unknown location, do you think that you could figure out which location it came from based on its microbiome?
Potentially. So we have seen this in other systems where the core microbiome are indicative of a certain group. But then again, as we saw with the humpbacks, those cores were seen in both ocean basins. So at this point, it's a little early to tell if we can use a certain microbiome as a biomarker for where the whales came from.
Okay, great. I can see there's a couple more questions in the Q&A to answer afterwards, but
okay.
We shall go on next to, we've got Ted up next talking about Happywhale, photo ID. So I'll pass it over to you, Ted.
Cheers. Oops, I forgot to share my screen first before I started. There we go. Can see my screen, I think.
Yep.
And there we are. Okay, well, brilliant. Thank you. Oops, let me get this Q&A thing off of here. How do I do that? Sorry. Okay, try again. All right, well, thank you. Delighted to be here. I wish I was on Braveheart with you, but I was actually in South Georgia at the time on a little yacht, having just gotten back from South Sandwich Islands, which was itself quite a voyage. But I come here really looking at trying to see how we can Okay, so the Southern Ocean, difficult place to work, very difficult to put ships out there, expensive, all kinds of logistical challenges. Even the availability of ship, even if you have the money, is not a given. And it is not by any means every year that a voyage as successful as the work on Braveheart can get there. So I've come at this from my own history of 27 years now of Antarctic expedition, tourist expedition leading in the Southern Ocean, looking to see how we can bring data from platforms of opportunity into whale science. And so a little bit of context here. First off, big thanks to the many folks involved in making this successful as far as it has come. Looking at the context, you've heard, as Jen said at the top, 170,000 whales killed around South Georgia within a day's sail of South Georgia in the last century. And where I come from, it's the stunning state of affairs where when you look at the architecture, the investment in removing whales from the Southern Ocean compared to what whales are there and have been there in the recent past, it's a stark contrast. So I first went to South Georgia in 1994, and from then through 2010 did not see a single nearshore large cetacean. That after, in this little graph of 20th century whale catch, I don't seem to be able to put a mouse over it, but it's right at the beginning that humpback whales, the main focus of my work, were largely removed. But we did a really good job trying to remove every commercially viable whale species from these oceans until by the end of the whaling period, there were just at best a few % of each species remaining. So for me, the contrast between these kinds of catch numbers per year, fin whales, blue whales, to this current state of affairs, or at least to recent times of almost no whales seen near shore, it's pretty stark. And I come into this with a science background, and doing now my PhD on humpback whale global distributions. But my time in South Georgia has been one of trying to interpret what we see there. Now, while we're in South Georgia and on my voyages, we are certainly land focused, and with sites like this, it's good reason to be land focused, lots of wildlife there. But much of our time is spent at sea, and the opportunity here is with roughly 70 voyages in a typical year now, this season just now entering being anything but a typical year. There were exactly 0 voyages such as this year. But in a typical year, which maybe this next year and certainly soon beyond that, how can we get data off of these vessels which are habitually traveling through? And there's a context here, which is while we'll never achieve the depth of Braveheart voyage, what we do have is repetition. And so if we can get structured, rigorous data that has real value to science, there's a lot to be contributed. So I'm going to briefly talk about that process and then get into what we found or maybe what we can learn from what we haven't found thus far. So, a few steps down the road, I've basically been at this for 5-6 years. I built a web platform called Happywhale, which is kind of a silly name just to make it catchy. But the idea here is asking the public, and as well as it's gone along, research collaborators to share data into an information architecture into which we built automated image recognition, in particular at this point of humpback whales, and we've come a fair ways down the road in terms of turning a data void into some data availability and hopefully an eventual data richness to really be able to understand these whales and complement the kind of work that Jen's amazing efforts on Braveheart and so on have been able to do. So first, a big shout out to really, one part of this is building the information architecture. One part of it is creating a system, automated image recognition, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But a big part of it has just been outreach, saying to the broader public, hey, this is what we're looking for. And if we want to talk about getting quality data out of these platforms of opportunity, there's real opportunity, but there's also real constraints. And so one of the obvious low-hanging fruit is photo ID images, where all we really need, this is presence only data, as in we're not saying, okay, the lack of a sighting at any particular day and time doesn't mean that the whale wasn't there. But if we do have a photo of a humpback whale, a blue whale, a right whale, any other species, we know if we have the date, if we have the ship that it was on, a location, if we don't have a precise location, we can corroborate that back from what ship that was on. And so putting that word out there, it's big thanks to the BEST project, to IWC SORP that built this little PDF to distribute around, IAATO, the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators, South Georgia Heritage Trust, the South Georgia government combined has really put this word out there saying, hey, images that come together through this one web platform will be broadly available. And it's through that we've gotten some of the data sets that you've heard referred to. We've tried to make it both simple and rewarding. And the simplicity part of this is set your camera so we know the date and ideally location if you have GPS in your camera, shoot the photos. We're interested in historic photos as well, as long as you can give us at least an approximate date and location, what platform you're coming on. It doesn't have to be a precise location. If you say we were around South Georgia, I don't know where, or we're on the Antarctic Peninsula, we'd love to have more precision, but send it to us, happywhale.com. We try to make it quite easy. But moving on into the actual content. So we're generally saying photo ID, and what we're referring to in that is individual recognition through natural markings as recorded in photographs. So here's a set of whales that I photographed in 2016 on the Antarctic Peninsula. What you see here is humpback whales. When they dive, they often lift their tails, and in doing so, they'll expose this ventral surface of the tail, which very conveniently has persistent markings that are absolutely traceable and trackable through the life of the whale. Generally speaking, with the automated image recognition we've built, we can tend to identify an individual from about 6 months, and certainly from a year or 2 years old through the rest of its life. Increasing errors at those very young years, and there's certainly some error sometimes with major changes like an entanglement or a ship strike, but it tends to be quite persistent. What you see in this image, that brown those are diatom slicks, mostly probably coconais, but other species as well. That comes off seasonally, but the patterns, the scarring, those are barnacle scars or various other also pigments. And then most particularly what we use is actually this trailing edge shape. So very successfully, we've managed to automate image recognition of this. And that's been, I'm in the midst of a PhD on that. That's one of the chapters of my thesis. If anyone's interested in it, it's in press, should be out and about in the next month or two. But specifically around South Georgia, well, South Georgia's been this data gap. And why? Because not a lot of whales have been seen there in recent times. And through the combined efforts, Jen's voyage provided a lot of the photo ID imagery that came into here, but as well from quite a few different contributors, mostly IAATO passenger vessels, Antarctic tourism vessels, but also some bass ships. And stepping back a little bit more broadly, there's South Georgia, South Sandwich Islands to the southeast. For scale, South Georgia there is about 110 miles east to west. If you exclude the southwestern corner of this image, which is the South Orkney Islands, South Georgia, South Sandwich Islands, we've now photo documented about, well, let's see, I think this precise number is 313 humpback whales. So I want to take a moment to talk about what we haven't found and what I can speculate from this. And this is actually where it gets very interesting. Now, so in South Georgia, if we have 300 something whales, well, where are we comparing this to? We're matching these humpback whales to a database globally 50,000 individuals strong. But most specifically, where we would expect to find matches is to a set of about 3,000 individuals from coastal Brazil. Now, Zerbini et al. Published a population estimate for the Southwest Atlantic showing a near full recovery of humpback whales in the area of, 28,000 individuals strong. And that's based on counts from breeding grounds, right? So just at the top of this image, coastal Brazil. And so if we have about 3,000 whales and there's just shy of 30,000 whales in the population, if that is of equal proportion, we should expect about a 10% capture probability for any whale photographed in South Georgia if they're all migrating to Brazil to breed. What I find really interesting, and here's where I'm completely stepping out into speculation based on what we've seen so far, is that we have nowhere near that kind of capture probability. It's down around like 1%. This one that I'm showing, actually the South Georgia image comes from Martin Collins from a bass vessel. And the northern image comes from a tour operator there. So a nice combination of research and citizen science. But I find that really interesting, because if we don't find that 10% expected capture probability, as far as I can see, it means one or more of three things. And the first to rule out is with regards to accuracy of matching. And it's certainly possible that we are missing matches. However, elsewhere in the North Pacific, where we have a data set that captures, actually, we believe we have captured about 60% of known individuals in certain areas where we have a really, really high representation. We've assessed the algorithm to have a 97 and 99% chance of finding any known individual, right? So if we know the animal is in the data set and we give it a test photo, it's a decent quality test photo, then we have a 97 to 99% chance of finding that match. So if you compare, photo ID studies seem to very rarely do a self-assessment of accuracy, but in one landmark study, the SPLASH study in North Pacific, they found a 90 to 91% capture probability, so, or rather a chance of finding any potential matches. So we've crossed that bar pretty well. So I can rule out an inaccuracy in matching. At least that could only explain 1 or 2% of the missed matches, if there are any. So the remaining explanations, as I see it, are either that the whales that we see around South Georgia, either or both, whales that we see around South Georgia are coming from different breeding areas, and that is possible. They could be coming from the Southwest Atlantic breeding grounds, Africa, off of Africa, or other places, undocumented breeding grounds. Or, and I think the best explanation, at least for most of this, is that while we do know 3,000 whales from Brazil and 300 whales from South Georgia area, well, maybe they're not actually the same populations quite so, or the same demographics that we're capturing. And this speaks to the cultural situation and the recent development situation of whales around South Georgia. And those of you who saw, I think it was in Amy's talk yesterday, Alex Zerbini's satellite tracks of whales off of Brazil, well, they went down towards South Georgia, but most of them, or all the whales, actually went to the South Sandwich Islands, not so much to South Georgia. So Phil Clapham used the phrase that the cultural knowledge of South Georgia as a feeding ground may well have been removed from this population. And I believe he hit that one spot on that nail on the head, because it would seem to me that what we are capturing around South Georgia are very young animals. And when we compare them to the 3,000 whales we know from Brazil, that's a data set over a longer period of time. So generally much older animals. So in fact, effectively for this local population, we know very few whales in Brazil, and thus wouldn't expect, or shouldn't expect that, we shouldn't expect 10% capture probability if we could only separate out and match to the youngest of those Brazilian whales. So it may be that going forward, we will find a much higher capture probability, but I think it's really interesting to think that here are whales that for whatever reason, whether it's just that essentially the whales that knew how to feed around South Georgia were the ones disproportionately killed, and thus the whales that remained just don't even think of South Georgia, and now you have this population that's rediscovering it, or even stepping out into very thin ice, some kind of, oh, don't go there, that's where whales die, cultural memory. I wouldn't go so far as to speculate that. It's interesting to think about. But in any case, it does seem that whales are rediscovering South Georgia coastal waters, which is certainly, they do tend to have fairly high site fidelity to feeding grounds. And we would expect in the complex local topography, bathymetry of South Georgia to see some of that. So with that, I'll end it and give a huge thanks again, a call out to images that are out there. If you've been to South Georgia and happen to see a whale, actually of any species, we're very interested in imagery. And going forward, what we're looking to is actually increasing the structural rigor of data that we get out of these ships of opportunity. No time really to talk about that, but big thanks to everyone who has contributed. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Ted. There's some intriguing things that you've brought up here, and I'm sure some of the folks in attendance who work on the Brazilian humpbacks will have some thoughts on that. At the end of our session at 9 o'clock tonight, I'll be taking more questions. So if anybody wants to circle back on Ted's comments here, maybe we can take a couple of questions at the end of our webinar and comment a bit further on his findings. So because we're moving on a bit with time, I'm going to ask Connor to speak next. Connor, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Perfect. And can you see the screen?
I can.
Ideal. So thanks for the invite to talk on this tonight, Jen. What I'm going to go through very briefly, and I'll try and keep to time as much as possible, is some of the work that I've been doing for my PhD. I'm currently a fourth year student at the British Antarctic Survey, and this is one of my chapters. And it's looking at humpback whale habitat use in and around the South Georgia marine protected area. And one thing, as I'm sure every talk over the past few days has mentioned, is that whales' history is very much one of exploitation. Between the 18th and the mid 20th century, nearing 300,000 humpback whales were killed globally, with 25,000 of these killed in just 13 years at South Georgia. And this intense harvesting over such a short period of time caused what Ted was talking about just a second ago, a collapse in the population in the South Atlantic. And this meant that humpback whales were broadly absent from the entire region and also from the whaling records for most of the 20th century. However, more recently, there have been signs of recovery. Sightings data in and around South Georgia from both tourist ships up the top here and from fisheries vessels are suggesting that whales are being seen more frequently around South Georgia. And model-based estimates have suggested that the Southwest Atlantic population of humpbacks has recovered to approximately 93% of their pre-exploitation numbers. And the whales that come down to use the waters around South Georgia are from the IWC's breeding stock A. And breeding stock A show this affinity between their breeding grounds off the coast of Brazil and their high latitude feeding grounds down and around the South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands and to the east of them. And this multi-decadal study conducted by Alex Savini has used Argos telemetry data and Alex has very kindly shared it with us to enable me to do this work. So thank you very much, Alex. What I'm trying to do with this piece of work here is to investigate the spatial overlap between marine protected area measures in and around South Georgia and humpback whale distribution. And to do this, I'm using habitat models. And a very whistle-stop tour of a habitat model is what it takes is locational data from animals and relates it to remotely sensed or or remotely sensed environmental data. These are then put together in a habitat model and a spatial prediction is produced. And the models that I'm using create this or predict a likelihood of occurrence of a whale from a low percentage to a high percentage. The data that I have to use spans from 2004 through to 2020. And all of the data that I have, I've truncated at 50 degrees south to reflect only data that's broadly south of the polar front and in polar feeding grounds. And this equates to 17 individuals over this period. I'm then modeling these data in a generalized additive model framework, as this enables me to look at non-linear responses between environmental covariates and whale presence or absence. And I'll be creating habitat models for the early summer period, which is October through to December, the high summer period, January through March, and then with the limited data that we have in the winter period, a winter model, April through July, noting that June is missing because at this point, the tags are often very low on battery and the uplink frequency to the satellite is often a little bit irregular and the locational precision of the uplinks is a little bit low sometimes. And then obviously an entire all data model, just as a comparison. So once these habitat models have run, these are the spatial predictions that have come out of them. So from the top left, we have the early summer model, the high summer model, winter model, and then the all averaged model. And what we have here is the model extension denoted by the big red border. And then within the border, we have the management measures implemented by South Georgia government. And then if we look at these more specifically on a model by model basis, in the early summer period, there's a significant overlap between the model predictions of where humpback whales are supposed to be going and the South Sandwich Island trench protected measure. Note in this period, in the early summer, there isn't much activity or almost no activity for humpback whales on the shelf of South Georgia itself. But there is an interesting sort of focal point or hotspot to the north of South Georgia in a region known as the Northwest Georgia Rise, which is, unfortunately, it's outside of the management zone for South Georgia government, but it's an interesting area to note. And then if we try and quantify these overlaps, if we've taken a threshold approach whereby you threshold or you take any region where there's a greater than 60% likelihood of a whale being there and compare that to the management measures, there's an approximately a 63% overlap between them, which is really encouraging. If we then move through to the high summer period, what whales are doing in the region has completely changed. They seem to have moved from the South Sandwich Islands into the heart of the Scotia Sea and also right around the coast of South Georgia itself. And at this time, there's a 93% coverage between the management measures and the whale distribution. And then in the winter period, what whales are doing again completely changes. We have a significant expansion around South Georgia itself. And there also seems to be quite a shift in distribution back towards the South Sandwich Islands in the southeasterly direction. And this could reflect, I'm sort of hypothesizing here that this could reflect a movement towards where the winter sea ice might be reforming and where krill likely remains at this point. Because late in the season, most of these individuals will have begun their northerly migration. However, if some are still remaining, the likely reason they're staying here is to feed. And if they're following the krill, then south of South Sandwich Island seems like a nice area to be. And if we are, again, quantifying these overlaps, in the winter period now, the overlap sits at just shy of 50%, which is also encouraging. But and then where am I heading next with these models? At the moment, these GAMs that I've produced predict the likelihood of occurrence of a whale, which is interesting, but perhaps a more informative approach might be to ask what are whales doing in these specific regions? Are they feeding or are they traveling? And if we can work out whether they're feeding in certain areas or just moving through them, these might have different implications for management. And this is a suite of models that I'm working on at the moment, and hopefully we'll be able to report further in the next few months or so. That kind of wraps me up for now. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions about this or the future models, then let me know. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Connor. I am just looking to see if there are any questions about this, but I think there's been one comment about, which is in relation to increase in whale populations in the South Atlantic. It's really a broader, it's a kind of a broader comment about whale populations seem to be increasing in the South Atlantic, but there is some evidence. Now, Patricia, you said the collapse of the krill population. I don't think there is any evidence for a collapse of the krill population, but there is some evidence of a shift towards the south, of increasing densities of krill further south in the South Atlantic than maybe a century ago. So there may be a change in distribution of krill. How do we marry that change in distribution of krill and the populations around South Georgia? Any comments, Connor, or the panel?
I would, if my microphone's still on, I would say collect more data. If we can get more wintertime data that reflect the entire feeding period for humpback whales, that would be really interesting and definitely something we could investigate in the future.
Thanks very much. Okay, no one else has a hand up. I will move on then, and we can take up next Russell Leeper, who's going to tell us about the ship strikes risks and whale densities around South Georgia.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Yes, I'm going to talk about the risk of collisions between whales and ships. And thanks to all the sponsors of the project, and particularly to Marine Traffic, who've kindly provided all the shipping data through an agreement with the International Whaling Commission. So anywhere that whales and ships coincide, that there's a risk of collision, and there's very little that large merchant ships can do to avoid whales. By the time they see a whale, if it surfaces in the path of the ship, then it's often too late to avoid a collision. But smaller vessels can also be involved in collisions. And the picture on the top right shows the Braveheart. And unfortunately, during our survey in 2020, we did actually hit a humpback whale. Luckily, we were only doing 9.5 knots at the time, and the whale seemed completely uninjured. But it does show that even with a full team of observers looking for whales, it's still possible for whales to surface underneath a ship without being detected. So the International Whaling Commission has established a global database of ship strike incidents to kind of help identify high-risk areas, identify the factors that are related to risk, such as the type of ship and the speed, and to provide information on which to base effective mitigation measures. The database now has around 1,000 records in it now, and from the Antarctic, there have been 9 reported strikes by IAATO vessels since 2001. And the whale species that are now found around South Georgia are all very high on the list of species that get involved in ship strikes. Globally, these are kind of ranked with the most being fin whales, followed by humpback whale, right whales, and sperm whales. And these are all species that are found around South Georgia, and blue whales as well kind of come surprisingly high up the list globally compared to their populations. The IWC has concluded that the only really effective mitigation measures are to keep ships and whales apart or for ships to slow down. And there have been a number of situations around the world where shipping lanes have been moved to reduce the risk. This does rely on kind of many years of data and predictable whale distributions. In areas where whale distributions are less predictable, or ships just have to go through an area, then slowing down is the best way of reducing risk. And the speed of 10 knots is generally the recommended speed to slow down to. So to look at the risk around South Georgia, we need to kind of look at the patterns of shipping, and to do that we used AIS data from satellites, and we measured shipping density in terms of kilometers traveled per kilometer squared. And you can see on the plot on the right that shows the distance traveled by the different shipping sectors in South Georgia to 2019. Fishing vessels are by far the greatest in terms of distance traveled, followed by cruise ships, passenger ships, and smaller amounts of cargo traffic and research vessels. But speed is an important factor for the risk of collision and also the severity of injury if a collision occurs. So we also look at the distribution of speeds of the vessels around South Georgia. And you can see that fishing vessels and research vessels tend to be generally slower than the cargo vessels and passenger ships, which are sort of in the region of a peak at 15 knots for the cargo vessels and 12 to 13 knots for the passenger ships. But an important aspect of both vessel traffic and whales at South Georgia is the seasonality. And you can see here from the seasonal patterns of fishing vessels that they're really only present from April to September, and with peak months of May to August. And you can also see the concentration of effort around the depth contours up the edge of the shelf and to the northeast of the island for the krill fishery. The seasonal patterns of cruise ship activity are almost exactly opposite. So sort of things start in October and November to March are the main months, and then very little else during the year. And the cruise ships tend to follow really quite predictable routes coming in from the southwest and the northwest, either from the peninsular area or the Falkland Islands, and most effort concentrated off the north coast. And you can see that here from the ship. There's quite a variety of different sizes of types of ship that do cruise trips to South Georgia. They all tend to follow very predictable patterns, and you can see this from a single cruise ship in one season of calling at many of the landing locations on the north coast and King Haakon Bay on the south coast. And this plot divides the speed between red showing speeds of greater than 10 knots and green speeds of less than 10 knots, which show that although much of the time the ships are going at greater than 10 knots, a lot of the time they don't. So it's obviously possible to travel at less than 10 knots. But to look at risk, we have to kind of overlay what we know about whales with the shipping densities. And this plot shows shading in red of the shipping densities, and then sightings of the whales from the 2020 surveys. The blue whales are blue circles, right whales are purple triangles, and fin whales are pink squares. And you can see that all these three species overlap with some quite high areas of shipping. it was the humpback whales that were really found in large numbers in 2020 that probably had the highest risk of ship strikes. And during our surveys on effort, we had 661 individual humpback whales during just over 2,000 kilometers of visual transects. These visual transects don't kind of cover the whole area, and so to get a bit more of an insight into the overall distribution, we constructed a spatial model, and you can see that's what's plotted as the purple shading, with the more intense color indicating kind of higher density areas based on those sightings, which are shown in red, and the tracks in pink. And then when we put this together with the shipping data, we can see that the typical passage of a cruise ship on a visit to South Georgia will pass through some high density areas of humpback whales, and the overall average densities of humpback whales at South Georgia for both 2019 and 2020 are similar to other areas where IAATO have implemented 10 knot speed restrictions to reduce ship strikes risk. And using a simple encounter rate model, which is essentially whale density multiplied by shipping density, taking into account diving behavior, we'd predict around 30 incidents a year where a collision would occur with a humpback whale if neither the whale or the ship took avoiding action. So we're not saying there is likely to be 30 collisions a year, because often whales do get out the way, but this is a good way of kind of estimating the overall risk. And to kind of sum it all up, I think there is a significant ship strike risk from summer cruise ship traffic. We don't really know enough about the winter distribution as yet to look at risks at other times of the year. And humpback, right, blue and fin whales are all vulnerable. And the level of risk is similar to other areas where measures have been taken to reduce risk. There's not a great deal of scope for routing measures, but speed restrictions would be appropriate and could be incorporated into voyage planning without too much inconvenience if there was an appropriate dialogue between IAATO and the vessel operators. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Russell. That's really interesting, and it just puts it into context, seeing how much shipping traffic overlaid with the whale densities there. There's a question here from Vasily. If speed restrictions are applied, what might be the fuel and carbon dioxide saving for cruise ships? Imagine that would be substantial.
Yes, I mean, we're looking at maybe a 20% reduction in speed for much of the time. And actually there was a recent study by Belgium of shipping in the North Sea, which looked at a similar kind of level of speed reduction. And they found that all greenhouse gas emissions and black carbon were all reduced by around 10%. And underwater noise was reduced by several decibels, so really quite a substantial reduction in noise as well.
Thanks, Russell. And there's another question from Bernardo, which sort of relates to how we measure density from our sighting surveys. He asked whether the 661 humpback sightings are definitely from distinct individuals, and whether it may be that we're resighting the same animals a few times.
It is possible that over the period of the surveys we're resighting the same animals, but what we're interested in is the density of animals. And so we're designing a survey to cover an area, and it doesn't really matter if a few days later it's the same animal or a new animal, it's still the same density.
Thank you. I have a question from Elling. How does the soundscape seem from the whale's perspective? Do you think they can hear the ships approaching?
They will certainly hear the ships approaching. the acoustic work that Susie was talking about yesterday, we often have to stop if there's a ship within about 20 miles of our sonar buoys, because the ships are so loud that we can't hear the whales above the noise of the ship, and so that will affect the whales as well.
Thank you. I have a question from Mariano. Will this information be made available to the tourists going on cruises?
I would imagine so. I mean, we've certainly been working with IAATO through the IWC Scientific Committee to kind of provide scientific advice in relation to the measures that they've taken around the peninsula. So I think a similar approach could be taken around South Georgia.
Thanks. Now we've got a question about zodiacs. It's been noted that there are lots of zodiacs being used by tourist ships and other ships in South Georgia waters, and that obviously the speed is much faster. Could they pose a risk?
Yes, I think they certainly can pose a risk to whales and other marine mammals at South Georgia, and speed is an issue. Possibly for the large whales, they're less likely to be operating in areas where there are high whale densities, because they tend to be a bit further offshore.
Thanks. Alice asks, do we know anything about the level of death resulting from strikes at the moment from these ship strike reports?
Not for the South Georgia area. The one problem is that a large cruise ship is unlikely to be aware that it's hit a whale. So in most areas, we find that the number of ship strikes that ships are aware of is only a tiny fraction of the numbers that actually occur.
Jeff asks whether the cruise ships have been asked to reroute their approach to South Georgia to avoid some of the whale activity.
It would be difficult to choose a route, I think, that would be kind of any better than any other, because we just don't have the data on kind of consistent patterns of whale distribution, which is why we think slowing down would be a more effective way than trying to reroute, because we just wouldn't know where to send the ships, and it probably changes between year on year.
Thanks, Russell. And I've got one final question from Zach. It's a great question. What's your view on the role of emerging technology to aid in the mitigation of ship strikes in future? So PAM, gliders, satellites, infrared, those kinds of tools.
I think there will be a role for it, but none of these tools are there yet. And so at the moment, we're pretty much stuck with trying to keep whales and ships apart, or slowing them down. But certainly as technology develops, particularly satellite imagery can be a potential tool to use. But at the moment, we really don't have much that we can do apart from slowing down or just trying to avoid areas where we know whales are.
Thanks very much, Russell. Some great questions there. Please do keep them coming. Any questions you have even later on any of the presentations tonight, please put them in, or even if you've got a comment on something you've heard and some things that you're thinking in relation to things that we've been talking about. We'd love to hear them, and we'll try and take them at the end if we don't manage them during the meeting. So thanks very much, Russell. That was a really interesting talk. And we're going to move on now to Professor Martin Collins, who's going to talk about whale monitoring at Cumberland Bay in the future. Martin, are you there?
I am, Jen. Thank you very much. I will try to share my screen, so please let me know if I'm sharing the right one.
Great.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, first of all, I'm a little bit of an imposter at this set of talks because I'm not really a whale specialist. I'm a sort of generalist marine biologist, but I now manage the research station at King Edward Point on South Georgia. I've actually been doing science around South Georgia since 1997, and as you've probably been hearing this evening, in the early years of working around South Georgia, very rarely saw any whales, but it's been a delight to see whales in recent years. And I was fortunate enough to be involved in the Braveheart survey last year, which was a fantastic number of whales around South Georgia. I'd already been at KEP prior to that, and we'd seen quite a few whales in the bay, and actually been on JCR. And I think Ted earlier mentioned photographs of one of the humpbacks we saw on JCR at that point. What I'm going to talk to you about this evening, hopefully, there we go, is starting to do some monitoring work of whales in Cumberland Bay, South Georgia. Now, you've seen, I think, pictures of South Georgia, and you're probably already familiar from earlier talks about Cumberland Bay, but this is South Georgia, about 100 miles long. Cumberland Bay is this very large bay in the centre of the northern part of the island. It's in the milder part of the island, and it was, of course, the centre of the initial whaling at Grytviken here, which is very close to King Edward Point. And the initial whaling, I think, as Jen mentioned earlier, a lot of that whaling actually happened, certainly for humpbacks in the first year or so, within Cumberland Bay itself. The whale catcher or catchers did not need to go outside of Cumberland Bay to actually catch those whales. However, in my first visit into Cumberland Bay was 1997, and right the way through from 97 probably to 2019, I think, it was very rare to see whales in the bay, and everyone got very excited if one was seen. But recent years, as you've heard, have changed that a little bit, and really following on from those recent sightings, we're now looking to try to establish some whale monitoring at King Edward Point. But I just thought I would tell you a little bit of the background about the base at King Edward Point on South Georgia. It's got a long history actually there, and I will show you in a second, because it was actually the location of Discovery House, which is where the Discovery expeditions in the 1920s established their first sort of scientific base ashore to study whales and the food of whales. And there was a land-based station there, Discovery House, as well as the work done on the original RS Discovery and the William Scoresby and the following vessels that operated around there. And that sort of Discovery House and the science at KEP eventually morphed into a British Antarctic Survey base in the sort of 60s and 70s. That base ceased to be operative as a science base in 82, but was re-established again in 2001. And it was established in 2001 really as an applied fisheries laboratory to help South Georgia government provide scientific advice and support for the management of the fisheries around South Georgia. And it's funded by the government of South Georgia and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK under contract to the British Antarctic Survey to provide that science in support of it. I've come back to BAS now, I've been back at BAS for almost 2 years, and we've sort of produced a revamped science plan, and are taking the focus a little bit away from the fisheries and more on sort of science and support of marine management. And from the base, we do a range of work, including penguin and seal monitoring, certainly some fisheries related work, and also plankton and oceanographic work in Cumberland Bay, to a lot of which is just helping us better understand the environment. So this just shows you close up King Edward Point. This is the main sort of scientific accommodation here. This building you can see here is the old Discovery House, which was refurbished in 2013-14 and is now actually accommodation for visiting scientists, and was used by Jen and her team in 2019 when they were operating out of KEP. It's situated, as you can see from this drone picture, sort of with a good outlook on Cumberland Bay itself. And you can get up to a reasonably sort of elevated point near the base here, which I'll talk about later, to get a good view out in the bay. And here you can see open sea in the background and the expanse of the bay. And this just gives you an idea of the scale of Cumberland Bay from Mount Juice, which is just up behind the bay. And there's a cruise ship there with a Zodiac or one of its boats going out, and you can see the Nordenskjold Glacier in the background here. And as Jem said in her introductory talk, this bay area was where they did catch quite a number of humpbacks in the early years of whaling, but actually we very, very rarely saw them. in future times. But what we've seen in the last few years is this return of humpbacks in particular to Cumberland Bay. So Jen and her team worked out at KEP using the facilities on the base in 2018, and they had quite a number of sightings of humpbacks both in the bay and in the area in which the small boats are allowed to operate down the coast between Stromness Bay and St Andrews Bay. And that was sort of the first indication, I think, really, that we're seeing more whales around, certainly in the coastal areas around South Georgia. I was then down on South Georgia in October, December 2019. It was my first visit in my new role back at King Edward Point. I've been there many times before, but in this role I was back down in October, December 2019. And we saw large numbers, up to 10 humpbacks at any one time in Cumberland Bay at that time. And we actually did some sampling with plankton nets in the bay at the time when the humpbacks were there. And we could see that actually the humpbacks were feeding, there was quite a lot of krill near the surface. You'll also see from this image here, which is some of the sightings from Braveheart, and Russ and others have alluded to these, but also big aggregations, large numbers of sightings of humpbacks just outside Cumberland Bay. It does seem to be quite an important area for them. So following on from my time on Braveheart and the realization that perhaps we had the opportunity at KEP to do a little bit more work on whales, we've started to establish some whale monitoring. This actually is footage of humpback whales feeding in the bay in November 2019. One of our scientists down there, John Dickens, was making use of drones, initially actually to monitor some of the elephant seals, fur seals and gentoos. But the presence of the humpback whales in the bay on that occasion gave John the chance to collect some very nice footage of them, but also made us realize there was an opportunity there. And you can see these whales they're feeding in Cumberland Bay. So what we've established now for Cumberland Bay is a sort of, during the summer season, really from October right the way through to March and April, daily monitoring of the bay from an elevated point near Hope Point here, not too far from the base. One or other of the scientists on base, we've got 2 there at any one time, will go out and do half-an-hour observations across the bay to see if there's any indication of whales present in the bay. Eventually, we may look to do some of this work with drones as well, but we haven't done at the moment. If whales are seen in the bay, we will then deploy the scientists on one of the jet boats, and we can do. And here's an example of one of the jet boats that KEP has 2 of these, which serve a multitude of purposes. The guys who go out on the jet boats can do some photo ID work, can do some behavioural observation, and there's also potential for other work, including sort of perhaps biopsies, even tagging in the future, if funding and opportunities allow. Now, we've also got the chance, of course, to collect ancillary data, either from the Falkland Island, the South Georgia patrol vessel, the Pharos, which can deploy small nets. This is a 1 metre square RMT net, which is fished down to about 50 metres, or from 50 metres to the surface, sampling the plankton, and we'll catch krill if krill is around and quite abundant in the area. So we're looking to implement that programme of work, and we started this off this last season with the advice and support of Jen Jackson. Unfortunately, this year has turned out to be different to the previous 2 years, in the sense that we've seen no whales in the bay at all this year. So whilst the team have gone out and done their observations from Hope Point every day, looking out on the bay, we haven't seen any whales in the bay this year at all. Now, I think there were some questions last night about this year, and this year being a little bit different, and wondering about what impacts this giant iceberg. This is the A68 iceberg that you can see on this slide here. This is from the Copernicus Sentinel satellite system. And that iceberg has been in the vicinity of South Georgia. It was stuck to the south of South Georgia for an extended period. It's now actually broken up and in lots of bits scattered to the east of South Georgia. The bigger bit here, A68A, is the only one of any real substance left. There's quite a lot of small bits of ice all around the place, but a lot of it has drifted off to the north and has actually started to go a little bit to the east of South Georgia. What we don't know actually is what impact that iceberg has actually had on South Georgia, because you'll remember earlier on that Jen mentioned the flow of krill coming from the Antarctic Peninsula is really important for South Georgia, and this large iceberg could potentially have disrupted that flow of krill from the peninsula region up to South Georgia. It will also have liberated an awful lot of fresh water into the surface, and that could also have had effects on the distribution of krill. So we don't really know what's happened this year. What we have seen on South Georgia amongst some of the other krill-eating predators is it hasn't been a particularly good year. So Gentoo penguins, for example, have not done particularly well. We've had quite a lot of breeding failure amongst the Gentoos, which we monitor near King Edward Point, and we also monitor at Bird Island on South Georgia. And we've also seen the fur seals, which are also krill eaters, not have a particularly good year this year. That may be a consequence of A68. We've historically seen good and bad years. There are occasionally years of poor krill abundance around South Georgia. They can be linked to sort of broader scale oceanographic things such as El Nino and the southern annular mode. So there are a lot of factors that may, other than the A68, that may have impacted on this. So there's the A68 all broken up. And just to sort of mention a few of the guys who've done this, I'll particularly highlight Kate and Megan, who are the two scientists down at KEP. They've been going out every day throughout the summer season looking for whales, but sadly not seeing them this year. I think they were very hopeful of getting out in the boats and doing the photo ID. John Dickens, who has been down there again this season, and John has been flying the drone, doing some more drone flying this year, but it's John's drone footage that I've been showing in a couple of sequences, and Phil Holliman, who works with me at KEP, and Laura, who provided some of the A68 imagery. And I just thought I'd finish for those of you who like to see some other whales. Rather unusually, end of October 2019, John Dickens was down doing some drone flights of the Gentoos and fur seals at Myvick and in West Cumberland Bay, rather than East Cumberland Bay where the bay is, and spotted a large blur of a whale not too far from the shore, and it turned out to be this blue whale here. So John got the drone up in the air and got some really nice footage of this blue whale. So really, it's work in progress. This we're hoping that we will see more whales around in Cumberland Bay in future years. We're now well set up to respond when we do, if and when we do start seeing them. It's just been disappointing from our perspective that this year we haven't seen any. Anyway, that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Martin. And it's lovely to see that blue whale in Myvick, and hopefully a sight we're going to be seeing again in future, though maybe not as luckily with a drone every time. So there's been a few comments over the course of your, I think John Barker's made some comments about work he was doing in working from Shack House in the early 70s, about the variety of science that was being covered, marine biology, terrestrial biology, glaciology, ionospheric measurements. So he's keen to catch up with more science that's going on at South Georgia. What's the best way to do that? South Georgia Association?
Yeah, lots of different ways. I think you can, by all means, put John in touch with me, and I can provide him with a bit more information about what's happening at King Edward Point this year or these days, and Bird Island. It's obviously different from the 70s and 80s when there was a much greater diversity of science happening. It's become, certainly King Edward Point has become very much focused on the marine and the marine management aspects on South Georgia, and moved away from a lot of the other perhaps terrestrial and other science that happened in the 70s and 80s.
Thanks, Martin. There's something else I just want to circle back on in relation to how all this work that we're doing also relates to the government of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, who have provided so much logistical support to all of our work on whales. Obviously, now the ongoing monitoring, but also our studies into ship strikes. And not something that I just wanted to circle back on there is that we're working really closely with the government on this problem. And in fact, they really helped us discuss, and think through how we were going to do this when we started to talk about it after the 2020 survey. So the government of South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands is planning to implement appropriate measures based on the evidence that we put together in relation to shipping traffic and whales at South Georgia in future. So watch this space for that. Hopefully we'll be publishing that work soon. There's a few more questions in the Q&A. Thank you so much. Please keep them coming. So we'll move on to the next talk now by Susie Calderan. And if we've got, we'll take a little bit of time afterwards and answer any other questions that are still outstanding. Susie, are you there? Susie, I can't hear you. Hopefully you're there.
Can you hear me now?
I can, yep.
It's always good if you unmute yourself, I find. Right. Well done, everybody, for hanging on in there. This is the last talk of the session. Good evening. I'd like to thank all our collaborators and all our funders, and for this particular piece of work, there's an awful lot of people that supplied all sorts of bits of data for us to be able to do this study, and thanks very much to all of you. So it was absolutely brilliant to see that drone footage that Martin just showed of the Antarctic blue whale off Myvik, and that was something that, even a few years ago, people would never have thought that you would have seen off South Georgia, not only a blue whale, but a blue whale that close into shore. And what I'm going to talk about is how blue whales seem to maybe be coming back to South Georgia after decades and decades of being away, having been pretty much wiped out by industrial whaling. So as we've seen from previous people's talks this evening, whales were absolutely hammered by 20th century industrial whaling, no more so than blue whales. And blue whales have seemed to take an extremely long time to start coming back, but maybe that is starting to happen now after some 50 years after whaling at South Georgia ended. So here's your obligatory dead whale picture, and this is quite an interesting picture by Frank Hurley, who's the expedition photographer, I'm sure you all know, on Shackleton's expedition. And so this would have been taken in 1914 when the expedition stopped at South Georgia on their way south. So at that time, whaling for blue whales at South Georgia had only just started. So it was at the forefront, South Georgia, of Southern Hemisphere industrial whaling, and which started in 1904 at Grytviken. But they started off pretty much with humpbacks because they were easy to catch. Blue whales and fin whales harder to catch because they're fast, and so you need steam-powered whale catching ships and exploding harpoons to be able to catch them. So blue whaling didn't really get going in earnest until about 1913. At South Georgia. Between 1921 and 1935, in the Southern Hemisphere, blue whales were the main species caught, and that's pretty much reflected at South Georgia as well, where the main period of whaling was for blue whales was between 1913 and 1937. So the highest catch year was the 26-27 season, where 3,680 blue whales were caught at South Georgia alone. But by 1935, numbers have been diminished so incredibly that they weren't the primary target anymore, and they were just caught opportunistically, because basically the population collapsed in 20 to 30 years. It was incredibly rapid. But even though after the mid-60s, when legal whaling for blue whales stopped, and slowly populations in the wider Southern Ocean started to recover, there didn't really seem to be any recovery taking place at South Georgia. And the first time I worked at South Georgia doing acoustics was in 2017, when I went there as part of the ACE voyage, which is a circumnavigation of the Antarctic continent in a season. And when we went there, the general feeling was that you'd be extremely lucky to see a blue whale at South Georgia. You know, people just very, very rarely saw them. Now, if you were here for my talk yesterday, you'll have heard me talk about dive-fast sonar buoys, which are self-contained hydrophones that you can deploy from a ship, and they not only transmit what they're detecting in terms of whale sounds back to your vessel, but also they have a compass in them that enables you to tell where the whales are in terms of a bearing. And we were deploying those on the ACE expedition. And when we got to South Georgia, we were surprised and delighted to be detecting quite a lot of Antarctic blue whale sounds around South Georgia. And we hadn't really been expecting that. And not only were we detecting them, but we were detecting calls called decalls, which are social feeding related sounds, and they don't travel anywhere near as far underwater as the song calls do. And so they're really a sign that the whales are close by. If you detect song calls, your whales may be hundreds of miles away, but these whales were really close by. They were South Georgia whales. And we were really extremely excited to see that when we did the ACE expedition in 2017. So we started thinking, oh, well, maybe our South Georgia, our blue whales coming back to South Georgia. And should we look at all the survey data that have been collected over, you know, the past few decades at South Georgia and see if there's any sign that actually there may be some recovery going on of blue whales at South Georgia. And this coincided really nicely with the Southern Right Whale project in 2018 and 2020. And so we thought, well, you know, while we're listening for Southern Right Whales, while we're looking for Southern Right Whales, obviously you can see and hear blue whales as well. So that was, you know, some nice new data to add to what we were doing, a bit retrospective to see if blue whales were coming back to South Georgia. So we looked at all sorts of data for this study. We looked at systematic visual surveys from the past 30 years. Now, there's not a huge amount of data. It's not an easy place to work. There's not a lot of survey data, but we looked back on all the systematic visual surveys. We looked at opportunistic visual sightings data. So that's data submitted to the South Georgia Museum by cruise ships, and also data from Bird Island, collected from land. We looked at photo identification. We also looked at acoustics. And you can see from here that between 1998 and 2018, over 34,000 kilometers of survey effort, pretty bleak, one sighting of a single blue whale. So, you know, up until very, very recently, really blue whales weren't doing at all well at South Georgia, which is what we had thought. But then there was the Discovery, the cruise on the Discovery in 2019. They did start seeing some whales, some blue whales. And then there was our survey this time last year, where we had 38 sightings of 58 individual blue whales. And that was quite a bonanza and quite an amazing surprise. And even though with an uptick in the data, that was quite a surprise. The opportunistic visual sightings data, 42 sightings over 30 years, and there wasn't a huge amount of change in that. But you'll see in the photo identification over the past 10 years, as you know, it's actually 43 individual blue whales now, but over half of those were photographed in 2020. No matches between the whales between years at South Georgia or in the rest of the Antarctic. So when we started looking at these data, we could see that there had started to be an uptick in very, very recent years, but until then it had been pretty flatline. So you can see on this map here, this is the plot of all the visual sightings. So that's opportunistic, reported from cruise ships, and also data from systematic visual surveys. So in red, that's all the sightings apart from 2020. And then in green, that's just 2020. So you can see how a huge proportion of the sightings of blue whales over the last 30 years are accounted for by the 2020 surveys. So, you know, really things have taken off very, very much in recent years. A couple of plots here which are data from the sonar buoy recordings. So this is the underwater hydrophones that pick up blue whale decalls. So on the left, these are 4 years of sonar buoy deployments. The pink little stars are from 2003. So Arne Širović deployed sonar buoys in 2003. And then the yellow are sonar buoys that we deployed from the ACE cruise in 2017, the green from the 2018 Southern Right Whale, and the red from the 2020 Southern Right Whale. So if you then look to the map on the right-hand side, these are estimated locations of these blue whale decall vocalizations based on the bearings that we get from the compasses on the sonar buoys. And you'll see that in 2003, Arne Širović did not detect any blue whale decalls at all around South Georgia, nothing. But in 2017, we were detecting a few off the southwest and off the north. Those are the yellow bearings. In 2018, we were starting to detect more off the shelf to the north. That's the green bearings. But then if you look at 2020, multiple concentrations of blue whale decalls all the way around the island. Obviously, it helped that in 2020, we were able to survey all the way around the island, but it just shows that there are multiple concentrations of blue whales all the way around South Georgia. So, 2020 was a particularly exciting year, and it was really, really encouraging. But you can see from these acoustic maps that actually something had been building up for a couple of years prior to that, whereas back in 2003, there was really very little indeed. So the blue whale story at South Georgia was tragic, and for a long time it looked like it might stay that way. Of course, we don't know what subsequent years are going to bring. This is very much the start of a recovery rather than an actual recovery. If you think we saw 50 whales and we were delighted to see that, but then if you think at the height of whaling, they were killing 3,000 a year. So it's the start. We hope it's the start of recovery. Obviously, as Russell was discussing earlier, there are management implications at South Georgia for increasing number of whales. But the South Georgia government is very committed to strong management measures. So there's a very positive local situation there for recovering whale populations. And if you want to find out more about the study that this talk's based on and our analysis of all the various different data sets over the last 30 years that are available on blue whales at South Georgia, then we published this in Endangered Species Research last year, and that's an open access paper. So if you look that up, you'll be able to read even more about it. Thanks very much, everybody, for listening. And yeah, thanks again for all our collaborators and supporters on this project.
Thanks very much, Susie. That's a really nice note to wrap up our webinar series for this evening. And there's a couple of questions for you here. If I can just take this one from John. He's asking, he's seeing many sightings off the Bay of Isles in the north and off southwest South Georgia, south of Anninkov, and wondered if you had any theories why, or any other team members, if you want to throw it out to the panel.
Of blue whales in particular, or whale whales?
He said sightings, so he could have meant both species, both humpback and blue whale species. But
yeah, I mean, a lot of it's down to food, and they go there to feed, and if there are good feeding areas, then that's where they'll be. I mean, certainly with the blue whales in 2020, when we were seeing plenty of them, as you could see from the map that I showed, actually they were all round the island, and there didn't seem to be any particular areas of concentration. But then if you look at those density maps that Russell was showing, there were particular areas that seemed to be high density. I don't particularly know, other than it's probably food related, because most things seem to be.
Thanks, Susie. We have another question, which is from Jeff. commenting that blue, humpback and right whales all depend on krill to a significant extent. Do you think it's possible that the rapid recovery of humpbacks plus krill fishing might have any influence on the recovery of blue and right whales?
In terms of availability of krill?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a krill scientist. Sure, they've definitely got to have enough to eat, obviously. I mean, the krill fishery at South Georgia is very well managed, and there's a krill fishing only over the winter, which is quite important. And I know that's the situation that the South Georgia government taking very seriously. I don't know if Martin has any input on that in terms of monitoring of the krill fishery in terms of whale feeding.
I think one of the, I think as you said, Susie, the fishery is limited to the winter. I think at the moment the levels of the fishery are not thought to be having an impact, and I think from the other predators that are monitored within the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources has a program of environmental monitoring, and there's no evidence at the moment that the krill fishery is having an impact on predator performance. And what seems to be happening at the moment is its other environmental factors are probably bigger. Clearly, as whale populations recover, that broad demand for krill will increase. I think there's some really interesting questions to be had out there. One being if the return of whales actually helps make food more easily available to some of the other predators, if there's any sort of cooperative feeding, if the whales bring food to the surface for some of the other predators. In terms of the krill fishery, I think South Georgia government are committed to sustainable management and will continue that way. The fishery is limited to the winter. However, there are some whales still around in the winter, of course. I think getting a better understanding of how many whales stick around in the winter, what their feeding demand is at that time, and also understanding the fishery does operate in a few fairly concentrated areas. One of those areas being to the northeast of Cumberland Bay. And it's probably no surprise, actually, if you look at the historical whale catches and where the krill fishery operates, they're in roughly the same place, because the whales were going to where there was a lot of krill and the fishing vessels are going to where there was a lot of krill. So there is that potential for competition. Because of this temporal separation between the main feeding time for the whales in the summer and the fishery being in the winter, hopefully that's minimized, but there could still be some carryover effects from depletion of the krill in the winter that might mean there'll be a little bit less available locally, I think, for the summer. I think when you look at the amount of krill taken by the fishery compared to the estimate of the total amount of krill out there, then there's probably no problem. But if you start having too much caught in very small areas and small spaces of time, it can cause a little bit of a problem. So probably a very long-winded answer to that question.
Thanks, Martin. And I think it's always worth bearing in mind as well that these species all have different ways of using their habitat. So blue whales being the largest animals on Earth, they won't really open their mouths unless there's a really nice, decent sized, dense swarm of krill. It's not really worth it because of the energy it takes. So for blue whales to be around, it shows that there must be really good quality, dense swarms of krill on the shelf to make it worthwhile for them to be feeding. Humpback whales can be a bit more flexible. They're smaller animals. Right whales may also be feeding on other species such as copepod crustaceans. So it will be useful to get more of a sense of what the different species are doing in the habitat as well, how they're feeding and what their krill preferences are too. I have another really good question from Ian Hart, who asks, do we know where South Georgia blue whales spend the winter?
No. Some of them stay in South Georgia. So during the height of industrial whaling, they were catching whales year round at South Georgia. So some of them stay put. In terms of blue whale migratory behaviour, we're pretty sketchy, to be honest, on where a lot of them go. No. Some other people on the panel might have more to add to that, but I don't think we really know whether they're South Georgia whales or whether they how committed they are to South Georgia and how faithful they are to South Georgia, we don't know. We see from the photo ID data that there haven't been any matches with South Georgia whales from any other whales in the Antarctic catalogue, but the catalogue's got just over 500 animals, and there's 40 something from South Georgia, so we wouldn't necessarily expect to see matches. And so, we don't really know.
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, I think that's, and in the South Atlantic, there's not tons of acoustic data, is there, to detect them at lower latitudes?
No.
There's another question here. Blue whale recovery seems to have been taking place in South Georgia over 17 years. Is that a relatively short time span and therefore a sudden increase, or quite a slow, long time span, and perhaps something we've only just noticed?
Recovery has probably been going on for longer than we've been able to detect it for, because the area is not terribly well surveyed. But it's interesting at South Georgia that whilst the general Antarctic blue whale population did seem to be slowly increasing, we weren't seeing increases in the same way at South Georgia. South Georgia seemed to lag behind in that respect. It seemed to take particularly long to start seeing blue whales back at South Georgia again. Whether that's a long time span or not for a population that was whaled to such incredibly low levels, long-lived, slow to reproduce animals, it's probably not an unreasonably long time at all. And in fact, it's quite impressive that actually they've recovered there at all, or even started to recover there at all.
Thanks, Susie. I think, and Connor's also just commented in relation to the wintering question that he's seen blue whales in the Weddell Sea covered in thick diatoms. So they must be overwintering in cold water. When they're also known as sulphur-bottomed whales for that reason. Yeah,
absolutely. And we've got some photo identified, I think Paula Olsen's probably on this call. We've got some photo identified whales from 2020 that are very brown, that do have a lot of diatoms on them. And that's really quite interesting that they're not going to lower latitudes, most likely.
Thanks, Susie. I'm going to take a couple of questions on some different topics as well, and you can come back to this because there's clearly a lot of, there's been a few good questions about the blue whales. Maximilian asked a broad question about the technological advancements that have clearly allowed us to do a lot of different types of whale research, which we presented here tonight. He commented that drones and satellites seem to dominate in this talk, but with also more traditional methods. What's the most effective way to gather data from whales? Personally, I think it depends on your question and the environment you're working in. Some environments you could maybe use satellite images. We can't use them easily at South Georgia. Other environments, it's very hard to deploy drones. So you really have to pick the tools based on the space. But I'd like to see if anyone else on the panel wants to comment. Anyone on the panel can just raise your hands if you want to say anything else on that. No, not seeing anything. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's.
I'm an acoustician. Acoustics is the best way to collect data.
I think it depends on who you ask. There's a question here about killer whales. And that's a really interesting one. Will there be an increased presence in South Georgia over time? Personally, I think so, yes, because we've got so many other species that that killer whales like to feed on in South Georgia waters. Obviously, as a top predator, their numbers are always going to be much, much smaller than that of the animals they feed on, the fur seals, the penguins. So you're not going to see them as often, especially in a short trip to South Georgia. But I think that there are definitely going to be more killer whales around. Anyone else on the team want to comment on that? So watch this space. We'll see if that's right. Certainly the team in 2020 saw quite a few killer whales, a few pods of killer whales, and got photographs of those. So they're out there, and hopefully we can do more research on those. There's certainly other groups who've already done some research on killer whales in the region as well. Ian Staniland asks, would long-term moored acoustic recording devices be useful for looking at year-round presence of whale species? Well, I think Ian might know a thing or two about this. Yeah. Susie, would you like to comment?
Yes, long-term acoustic recorders are a great idea. They're logistically quite difficult. You need to have networks of them really to make them effective. And you need to understand what the vocalizations are that you're hearing. So, for example, yesterday I was talking about making sure you can tell the difference between right whales and humpback whales, for example. Blue whales are great because you can always tell who they are. But yeah, acoustic moorings are really, really useful for long-term data sets on temporal occupancy, for example, migration routes. And so, yeah, so logistically they're difficult. They're not easy to deploy and they don't always work. But yeah, they're a great idea, especially somewhere around South Georgia. A network of acoustic moorings would be absolutely great.
Yeah, that's great, and it's probably worth noting the British Antarctic Survey are doing acoustic monitoring, which was initiated by Ian a few years back. So hopefully, with those data being analysed, we're going to start getting a bit more of a sense of what's happening from static moorings as well in the locations to the west of the island.
Yeah, really interesting to know what's happening in the winter.
There's a good question from Terry. He's asked how many dead whales have washed up on South Georgia. It's really challenging to know that in any really remote place, because obviously monitoring's not being done on the south coast of South Georgia. My experience, and maybe panel, if the panel have any comments, they can jump in here. I think there's maybe been 2 or 3 strandings in the last 10 years that have been seen and reported. So they would have been on the north coast. Of course, the rat eradication team went all around the island, so perhaps there's a little more data than that. But there's not particularly any sign of whale stranding happening at South Georgia. No other comments on that. There's a question for Carolyn from Maximilian. How on earth do you manage to aim your drones so precisely? Do you have to wear VR goggles, and do you lose drones doing this work? How many do you lose a season?
Well, so typically for the blow sampling, we fly a pilot co-pilot team. So both the pilot and the pilot generally is watching the drone itself, and the co-pilot is actually looking at what the drone is seeing. So and the co-pilot basically directs the pilot. Sometimes the pilot also uses a FPV, which is first person view. Yeah, and as for losing the drone, not necessarily for blow sampling, because we fly high enough, although I have seen one go in the water doing so. The only other time I've seen lost a drone, but we recovered it and it had to be rebuilt, was when there was a problem with the battery, and the battery ran out of juice right before getting back to the boat for landing. So.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Sure.
I think there's a few questions that have come in on the relating to the shipping and whales. So just maybe questions to put to Russell. Larry asks whether there are too many ecotourism ships. I think that's quite a tricky one, because it's not something that we really have any interface with. But I guess, of course, this is where Russell's points about maybe ship speed, which is something the government will be considering, and obviously would be putting to IAATO, could really help. Russell, I don't know if you have any other comments about that.
Yeah, it's very hard to say kind of how many is too many, but I think, yeah, it really is a case of just trying to reduce the risks where we can.
Thanks. And in relation to that as well, Russ wanted to note that zodiacs, because of IAATO regulations in South Georgia waters, zodiacs are restricted in speed and proximity when working around whales and in fact all wildlife. And I know that's particularly a concern in South Georgia waters. So I think it's important that we highlight that, given that we were talking about zodiacs earlier. Art Gertle asks, given the increased tourist and researcher traffic, are whales becoming more sociable in terms of initiating contact and close encounters with zodiac-born humans? That's not something I can comment on, but Ted's got his hand up.
I was actually in reference to the previous point. It's very encouraging. There was 100% unanimous consent on the Antarctic Peninsula. A proposal was adopted unanimously to reduce speed among tour operators within a 2,000 square kilometer region, the most, well, generally what we consider the most whale populated part of the peninsula. That would be worthy of questioning because that's where we see the most whales, but that's a little bit effort biased. In any case, there's very clearly a willingness and an interest from the tourism industry to work with government of South Georgia and all parties to reduce risk to ship strikes. And I say that kind of both with my tour guide hat on and the whale science hat on. On the peninsula, we're certainly seeing a lot more sort of whale-friendly-ish behavior. But in South Georgia, you just don't have the kind of glassy, calm waters with whales up close, which we might hope for and expect if whales start coming into the interior bays. But you know, still, even with these recent really fun and encouraging developments of whales coming into the bays, you know, the vast majority of whales that are seen around South Georgia waters are still outside where you're seeing it from larger ships, and typically not with really glassy, calm conditions. So whales aren't necessarily coming up close and socializing per se.
Thanks, Ted. I mean, I think there's been a few questions about blue whale recovery and humpbacks. What's limiting the blue whale recovery compared to the recovery of humpbacks in the area? Elling asks. I think it may be just because blue whales were exploited later than humpbacks and they have a longer generation time and a slower population growth rate. I don't believe there's any evidence for a limit, but Susie might have a comment on that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think they were exploited later and they were maybe knocked down even harder. And so, you know, they're coming back from an extremely low level. So it is all just taking longer. So I don't think there's any like problem as such. It's just that they've got a bigger mountain to climb.
Thanks, Susie. I think just some broader point, Larry asks, how, as the general public that loves South Georgia Island, like we do, how can the general public, besides donations, help scientists in our work? Well, I mean, I think there's probably two things that spring to mind for me. Obviously, the photo IDs are immensely valuable. So any photos that you know that yourself or family, friends, people that have also gone down that you know have taken of whales, they are so valuable, and we don't always know how valuable they can be. With the kinds of matching tools that Ted uses, for example, even just part of a shot of a humpback fluke can sometimes be matched. So, you know, there's a lot of value in those photos. And then, of course, you know, people that love South Georgia and conservation of the marine environment and sort of spreading the word about keeping the oceans clean is obviously a really good thing. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has any other comments to that. No? Okay. All right. Thanks very much for that question. And then Phillips commented that there are recent records of blue whales off north, east and central Brazil during July. That's really interesting. I think, yeah, maybe there were also a couple of catches. So I think as blue whales recover, we might be seeing a little bit more of them in the Atlantic. Certainly, of course, they were heavily hunted off South Africa as well. So perhaps that's also an area that they might be returning to eventually. We had a question from Elizabeth about viewing these webinars after time. So we'll use the Facebook page. Go to our Facebook web page, SGWhale. And if you type in SGWhale in Facebook, we will be linking to those. And we'll also be sharing them with South Georgia Heritage Trust, who very kindly hosted this meeting. And I'll also put them on the British Antarctic Survey website with our whale pages. So you can find them in a few places when we upload them. I think finally, just a comment from John to ask participants to join the South Georgia Association and the South Georgia Heritage Trust, both great association and trust there that will keep people in the loop about what's going on with South Georgia and any news and updates, science and outreach and all kinds of communications from them. So yeah, I'd really encourage that. And I think now, given the time, I'm going to wrap this up and say thank you so much to all the panel and to the amazing, all the amazing panel and the team who have who've done this work. We wouldn't be here without everybody who's contributed and time and effort. And thank you to all of you for attending and for all the great questions. And please do follow up if you've got questions for us later. We always love to talk about whales at South Georgia. So just wanted to say thank you and good night.
Thank you, Jen. Well done.
All right. Take care and keep an eye on the South Georgia Right Whale web Facebook page for updates of what we're doing next. Bye.